Sean, so much for having me today. I do appreciate it. As mentioned, I am Katie Arrington, the Chief Information Security Officer here in Acquisition and Sustainment at the DoD. I like to be referred to as the mom of the CMMC, but that is something that is bigger than me. It really is about the mission. The CMMC, which is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, has been a DoD initiative for the past 2 years, and we have come a long way. We're actually in the launch phase right now, where we're getting the Cyber Third-Party Auditing Organizations CMMC Level 3 certified. We're in the process of adjudicating the final round of the public comments of the rule itself. That's taken a lot of work on my team and getting through all of those. And hats off to the DAR Council. If you don't know what that is, it's the Defense Acquisition Council. Just a tremendous group of people who really believe in the mission, have been working so hard behind the scenes to get us to where we are. But we are at launch. We have had to move 3 pilots to the left because we didn't have the C3 PAOs through the process to actually start certifications. But we are not stopping. It's just there were so many moving parts to this entire effort, and the fact that we've slipped, I think, 60 days on the total schedule since start, I'm still in amazement with the pandemic and everything else that's gone on. So we have the CMMC accreditation body, the AV, has hired a CEO. They have full-time staff now, so they're moving off of the volunteers who have been there for so long, and we as a nation owe them a debt of gratitude and thank you for their continued effort to get us to where we are. But they have hired a great CEO, a man by the name of Matt Travis, and he's running the accreditation body. They have let several contracts out as they're setting up the testing, the training capacity around the country. We have created the assessment guides, the CMMC assessing guides. Those are created by the DoD along with the model in collaboration with industry and academia. And academia is a big one to get those ready. So we are rocking and rolling. We forecasted 15 pilots in FY21. We'll probably end up with 10 in FY21, still on target for 75 additional contract pilots in FY22. DHS has already acknowledged that they are looking to roll out CMMC into their contracting strategy late FY21, early FY22. We have GSA already leaning in on it. So we are well on our way to having the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification out and in industry. So with that, I could talk for days and days, but would absolutely love to turn the conversation over. I think the reason why you guys are dialed in today is to listen to a conversation, not just Katie Arrington speak. So let's get at it.
Awesome, Katie. Yeah, thanks for some of that intro. And kind of bringing us up to where we are and some of the questions that we have for obviously the great panel that we have and having you on board too, which is really, really excellent. I think this is one of the first talks around higher education that you've been able to give. So thanks for joining us. So with all that, question number 1, and we can kind of break this up amongst the team, but Katie, I'll go ahead and let you have kind of the first whack at some of these. So the first question, in the development of CMMC, were universities and research institutions initially considered in the overall scope of CMMC? And if so, how?
Oh my gosh, yes, from the very beginning. So Carnegie Mellon, Johns Hopkins, APL were absolutely fundamental to the development of the CMMC, best practices, 100%. And then we went out and actually started talking to academia. My previous life was in South Carolina, and by the way, Mary, thank gosh you're not from Duke. So I can say I'm a big proponent, actually, of the universities. and how we could build this into curriculum. Was one of the founding tenets of the CMMC is that these in computer science and in a lot of the freshman 101 classes, teaching basic cyber is a critical skill that is needed and necessary as students are going through their education life cycle. They need to understand, as I said earlier, that their intellectual property is very important. So a lot of universities from the very beginning were in the discussion with us, helped us, as I mentioned, the two leading ones. And then I did many tours, across the country with universities specifically to get their thoughts and feedback about cybersecurity and how critical it was and best practices and what they were doing. But, from, where you guys sit, Mary, do you feel like we've included you guys in the conversation? Could we do more? Could we do less?
I feel that there has been quite a bit of interaction with higher ed, a lot of contribution, obviously, by higher ed to the program. Very supportive of the aims of the program. One thing that I'm very excited about that I think will be a more systemic thing that's happening is the CMMC accreditation body has established an academic advisory council, which is being set up right now. We're hoping to get a press release on that out in the next couple of weeks. But this will be a forum to do really three things. One, it's an opportunity for us to help support the program through our educational mission. I know I've talked to several people in my own institution and other institutions that are interested in helping, say, train assessors, looking for aspects of the program to build into our own academic mission. So there's that aspect. The other thing is that as we wrestle with how to implement this in our environment, and we can talk about that later, there are unique aspects of universities that are different than your sort of traditional defense industrial base member. And it'll be important to bring those to the surface and help the CMMC accreditation body tailor what it's doing for those circumstances. The one example I'll give is that all research at a contemporary university is intrinsically collaborative and interinstitutional. And it's challenging as we think through our own implementation of CMMC, how to tackle that collaborative element when we have researchers across the globe. And then finally, I think the Academic Advisory Council will be a terrific forum for a permanent, established communication channel from the DoD, the CMMC accreditation body, and academia. Just the surface questions, issues, streamline communications. I'm very, very excited about this.
Awesome. Great insight from everybody there. So the next question we have is, again, let's start with you, Katie. Has there been any coordination with the Department of Education as it pertains to adopting CMMC and implementing CMMC for those organizations and really just even beyond those universities and research institutions that just support the DoD in some cases? Or maybe not just, but as a part of all of the activities at the university, they support the DoD, and really extending it beyond that to even if they do not support the DoD, those universities would still need to implement something like CMMC and go through the process of getting a certification like the CMMC certifications that are going to be available, or other higher education governing bodies beyond just the Department of Education. Have you discussed anything with those organizations or agencies as well as it pertains to CMMC rollout beyond just the DoD?
To be honest, I have not spoken to the Department of Education, and that I will make a note that I need to reach out, but other federal agencies, absolutely. We talk about it quite frequently at the Federal Acquisition Security Council, the FASC. I'm the DoD representative there, and we do talk about CMMC and how to cross-pollinate that. It was also in the National Cyber Solarium report that was published in early 2020 that effort talked about in one of the core tenets was a national cyber certification program. Now, in the Solarium report, they said it should be built upon the DoD's CMMC and be voluntary for those that, weren't in the DoD, to understand that some of our federal partners can't require CMMC. It's best practices. You look at what CISO DHS does. They put out the best practices, and having a third party come in and just review. I use the analogy. When I get up in the morning, I think I look great, and when I look through the camera now, it's like, oh wow, that is not the way it looked this morning. It's always better to get a third party. This camera is a heck of a third party for me to validate where we are and what we're doing, and is it beneficial? I think that as the CMMC stands up and really the accreditation body gets moving, and the academic advisory board, the industry advisory board, it's the reason the DoD sought out to work with a nonprofit was the exact reason that of getting the interest in from academia and industry in that capacity. We all need to come together and really work as an effective team about this. And this is risk, right? This is about threat.
Sure. So I think it's important to acknowledge that one of the challenges that universities face is that we are funded by multiple sponsors, multiple federal agencies, and often non-federal entities as well, whether that's industry, nonprofits, et cetera. And so one of the aspects of positive aspects of the original CUI program, Controlled Unclassified Information Program, and CMMC is really an extension of protecting CUI, is that it gave a framework, a consistent framework for all federal agencies, and a consistent baseline based on regulation, law, and government-wide policy. So that really eliminated or intended to eliminate the need for Homeland Security to have a set of rules, HHS to have a set of rules, DoD to have a set of rules, because it really was, prior to the original CUI program, the wild, wild west. We would have a project subject to these set of controls, and then another project subject to a totally different set of rules. So as a compliance officer at a university, it does excite me to have a consistent standard across the federal government. But I think we always need to be careful that that consistent control and that consistent standard needs to be right-sized. So one of the aspects of CMMC that I think is really, really thoughtfully crafted is the levels, right? You have level 1 controls, which Katie, you mentioned the basic cyber hygiene. That's a set of controls and a set of policies at a level of maturity necessary to control federal contract information, but not necessarily controlled unclassified information. Level 3 is that baseline standard necessary for CUI across, and if that was across the federal government, that would be very helpful. So one of the things we've struggled with, for example, at universities, is the Department of Ed has mentioned they want us to control student data at the NIST 800-171 standard, which is not really consistent with the CMMC levels, right? Level 1 would probably be more appropriate for that, potentially not. But so anytime we can get consistent guidance, consistent standard across the federal agencies, that's very helpful. But I want to be careful that we are right-sizing control and not over-controlling. Because yes, we want to protect the information, but we also want to make sure that the research and that collaboration that Michael mentioned is happening in such a way that the research can be conducted and that scientific endeavor can advance, because that's just as critical to the nation's economic development as protecting it.
Yeah, let me extend the one thing Mary said that I think is important here. I agree, this bringing some consistency to our world, so we don't have to have spreadsheets with 15 regulatory schemes mapped to one another, drives us crazy. But the other piece is that When I give presentations on CMMC to my community, obviously the folks that work on DoD contracts, and we have quite a few at UCSD, they're very interested because they see this as the rules have changed. What do I need to do? But I have a slide in there where I say it's not about the DoD. It's actually, CMMC is just the canary in the coal mine. I believe in the next 4, 5, 6 years, all the sponsoring agencies are going to have much more prescriptive security controls in their agreements. And really what we need to start doing is look at CMMC as a tent post, the central tent post around how we secure regulated research data. And what that means is that you'll start getting this basic cyber hygiene practices bleeding out into the broader community generally. And honestly, what we hope to do as we build out our CMMC enclaves is offer some of those services to non-DoD researchers that have high levels of regulation around their data. So if you need a CUI managed workstation, even if it's from NIH or the Department of Agriculture, we want to be able to say, we have a service for you. And so we see this as sort of a really big tent in the long term.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So that kind of brings me to the third question is, would student access to research performed on behalf or for the DoD be an in-scope variable and cause for some concern for universities? And kind of a second question to that, what is the proper approach to identifying the full scope of CMMC and at the university where CUI is, and where do contractual obligations lie across the university, and how do you kind of wrangle that?
It certainly would be a concern. It's going to be the same as any company that is doing that type of work. The student is need to be considered as an employee and be evaluated to make sure that they have the proper access rights and need to know for it.
Whether you're a student, a guest of the university, or a Martian who happens to have landed on campus, if you're touching CMMC data, we're treating you basically the same. But to your question, it's a real interesting problem for universities because the research mission is very, very different than enterprise security. We know where our enterprise applications are, enterprise data. Research, though, is culturally much more agile than we are in the enterprise, the business side of the house. It's much more MacGyvering going on in those labs. They're inventing equipment all the time, a lot of custom developed software and hardware. So we know a lot about where our research is. If I went to Mary's counterpart at my university and said, where are the dangerous chemicals on campus, or where are the biological agents, I would get a list. But when it comes to where is all the critical research data, we could start looking at contracts. We work very, very closely with our contracts and grants people to identify contracts that have regulatory, whether they're DoD or otherwise, obligations around them. But we're also launching, but we also recognize that there's a lot we don't know that takes place. A lot of third-party intellectual property, for example, that may really only be understood by the researcher and the company funding it. So we've started a program we called Cybersecurity Certification for Research, and it's modeled on the certification model of CMMC. We're a big place, so it's a self-certification model, but we're requiring all faculty and non-faculty researchers to go through a fairly lightweight self-certification where they identify what kind of work they do, what their critical infrastructure is, what is the contact information so we can do good incident response. We force them to document their data backup and recovery strategy. And then we give them some very lightweight security tools, anti-malware software, vulnerability identification software. And we say, you really need to run this wherever you can, whatever is supported in your infrastructure. Once we get through this program for the whole campus, and again, we've probably on the order of 3,200 faculty and non-faculty researchers. We're going to have basically the terrain mapped out, the topology of research at UCSB. And that'll allow us to then go, okay, here's the red zones. We got to go knock on doors and do deeper assessments. So it allows us to understand the whole ocean without boiling it and figure out where do we really need to go put our resources, where's the high risk. So that's the program that we're in the middle of launching right now.
So I'm going to answer that question as it relates to my previous institution, Purdue University, where I was the Director of Research Information Assurance. I've only been at NC State for a month, so I'm still learning kind of the ground rules here. But what I've seen is fairly similar to what Purdue's approach is. And as Michael pointed out, the obligation and the identification of the regulated data typically comes through a contract term, whether that's a contract for a project agreement, or it's a non-disclosure agreement, or it's a material transfer agreement. That's typically how an institution is going to be able to recognize and identify where regulated and sensitive data is going to be present within the research space. So at Purdue, when that was identified by our contract negotiators, they would work with our office, the Information Assurance Office, and we would assess based on the risk of the data, the details of the lab, the makeup of the lab as far as personnel, foreign or domestic, the type of research that it did, experimental, computational, et cetera. And we would make the assessment as to what type of control plan was necessary. That's how we addressed the CUI, NIST 800-171 requirements that came through the 7012 clause. And the plan was to leverage that same process for the CMMC compliance. So that, to Michael's point, that was how Purdue was getting our hands around that regulated data. The other thing that we tried to do was approach it from an awareness perspective, which is those researchers that were likely to be creating promising technology, technical data, certainly that might be relevant to future applied research for the DoD or industry. We tried to get them on board, let them understand the value of, to use Katie's term, their intellectual property that might develop into regulated research at that time. And we really targeted those researchers, be they faculty, students, or postdocs, in an awareness program to let them know, pay attention to the potential uses of your research, and be aware of, those good cybersecurity, that good cybersecurity hygiene that's necessary. And more importantly, we tried to educate them on the threat, because a lot of researchers aren't thinking in terms of threat and assets. They just think it's my research and I'm ultimately going to disseminate it anyway. But we wanted to let them know that, you want to control the dissemination of your research in a manner that you control and the timing that you control. And if someone gets access to that research prematurely, they can then abscond with it and do, maybe even build their research on it. And then you lose the value of that research if somebody else is published. So we really tackled it in two ways. We had a process by which we identified that regulated data and put control plans in place with the appropriate assessment tools, et cetera. And then we kind of broadened the awareness to those researchers that may potentially eventually get into the regulated research space, or their research might evolve to something that's necessary to the Defense Department or national security. And we tackled that from an awareness of the threat perspective.
The one thing I'll add to that, Mary, is we run into this all the time when we're out giving presentations. The faculty will say, look, my data is public, it's freely available. What we try to get across to people, though, is whereas we mostly talk about data, I'm largely worried about cyber resilience of our cyber infrastructure. So what we see very frequently, especially with state actors, is they are looking for any open door they can get to establish a foothold, and then they pivot through the institution trying to get to what they're really targeting. And so we see a business machine, in the School of Business attack. We see a machine in the dance department, a random machine anywhere on campus being used to launch attacks against more interesting targets. So even though they may feel their data is not of any interest, they don't represent any risk, they become part of that chain. And we have to, people understand that, but you have to explain it to them very carefully.
Actually, I would also add that it's not just the technology and the technical data and the research that they're interested in. They want to know who's doing the research.
Yeah,
they want to
absolutely.
know the postdocs and the faculty and the grad students, because they may ultimately try to position someone within that lab if they can, or reach out to that researcher. So we also want to make sure that they understand that their relationships and the research that they're doing makes them a target as well. So we spent a lot of time at Purdue working on insider threat awareness, and acknowledging it's not just the cyber threat, it's also the fact that there's soft threats that may come at them, and they need to be aware when somebody is cold calling them about their research or reaching out to take a visiting scholar position in their lab, that they need to really think about that relationship critically, so that they're not, kind of exposing their lab to a vulnerability.
Absolutely. And it goes right to that issue of the fact that we have so many students working in these labs, which is just the nature of how research is done. I don't think most people outside of universities understand how tightly coupled our educational and research missions are. Students come to a large research institution like either of ours because it offers these opportunities to participate in research. And frankly, I think that those opportunities may influence career choices more than their regular coursework. And what that means is the experience of research for these students builds passion in the field, and that goes right to the workforce function of developing students and people to work in these fields and keep them vigorous, which is why state actors, especially certain countries, may look for those students, as you say, to leverage as human intelligence gathering in these sensitive environments, which is why we do the same thing. We do a lot of work looking at personnel screening and that whole issue of insider threat. It's a big challenge for us.
That same methodology is how the adversary works in through the supply chain. They're not it's too much of a heavy lift to really go in and go to the pinnacle of the nuclear triad. It's a lot easier to go into the person that isn't really paying attention and work through. And our adversaries are patient. That's the one thing. I mean, you got to think about, they're very focused. China has a 100-year plan. They don't deviate off of the plan. It's very focused to what their goal is to achieve. And when it comes to research in academia, they absolutely are interested in that out-of-the-box thinker, that student or professor or graduate student that's doing really, bleeding-edge work, what they like, where they socialize, what are the things that attract them or their hobbies, so that they can intertwine themselves in there and influence in ways that, we don't generally think. People are susceptible, and the insider threat is huge. We talk and we go out to, have a drink or have a meal with people and talk about our passion. People very rarely look around them to see who's listening to them. We learn that in OPSEC training here in the Department of Defense. It's not necessarily something that you teach someone, but if you are working on, post-quantum computing, your highly involved encryption capability or hypersonics or composites or additive manufacturing, they're very interested in what makes you excited, what are the things that would entice you to come work with them, where those pockets of people go and work. You tend to go work in career fields with people that you've been in school with, and they're very interested in that. It used to be we used to talk about the 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon. You can get to know 6 people to get to Kevin Bacon. Well, that works the same way in research, right? How do I get to that person? How do I get to that capability? And it's not they're very advanced in how they get there.
Oh, I was just going to point out that 2 things. Number one, the challenge is that's also how research gets done, right? Somebody has an interesting, concept or an idea or a passion, and they want to find other researchers that are equally incentivized to look at that. But that's also the way that a malicious actor is going to try and get at that researcher. So we really need to empower our researchers to have a nuanced understanding of operational security, OPSEC, as you mentioned, Katie, and being able to kind of trust their gut and recognize, is that researcher really in it for the same reasons I am, or are they trying to get me to create a conflict of commitment and work on behalf of somebody else? And so it really requires us to kind of pay attention to that and get them to be thinking about that. But I'll also point out that insider threat, it doesn't matter if you're a foreign student or a foreign faculty member or a domestic, U.S. citizen. I always point out in my training that Reese Ross was born in the United States, and he was the faculty member who went to jail on behalf of China, was sharing and taking technical data and acting really on behalf of a foreign government. But that was a U.S. born citizen who made that choice. So, it's important to recognize that malicious actors come in all forms and sizes, and good people and dedicated researchers also do as well. And it comes to what behaviors and what choices and what conflicts are they, how are they being, how are they acting? Are they acting with integrity? Are they acting ethically for the benefit of the research and the university that they're working for? Or are they acting for someone else? And that's when you can really identify an insider.
Okay. Yeah. So let me ask this to the team. So why are universities unique? We kind of already talked about it a little bit, but let's expound on that. Why are universities unique in the applications of CMMC?
One of the biggest differences between a defense contractor and a university is that universities have to teach. That's their goal, is to be able to teach students and be able to produce good research out for the world. And a lot of that research is driven by organizations that want us to freely release that data out to the world. But when you have a DoD contract, you can't release that data freely out to the world. So you have to be able to work to separate that and teach your students how to properly separate that and vet your students properly to be able to be in there as you would any employee.
So this is exactly one of those areas that we're wrestling with right now, in that it is the rare research laboratory that does solely, CUI work. Almost all of the researchers, even in say our areas that are highly funded by the DoD, also receive funding from other agencies. They do public work, they teach, it's that synthesis that's very powerful for the research mission, but it's very challenging when it comes to implementing some of this more advanced CMMC controls. Physical space. I mean, I honestly believe you could solve world peace easier than you can solve the battles. And so you take an environment and you tell the researcher, well, you have to segment off your CMMC work, and they're not quite sure what to do. So, we're wrestling with that. And I think about especially mixed use environments that are expensive to build, such as machine shops. They may get plans that are marked as CUI. So we do things now like turn on a light, kick everyone out, insulate special equipment. But those kinds of controls are challenging in our environment, especially at scale.
All this kind of makes me think, or it kind of brings me back to some of my personal experiences. So when I was in undergrad, little known fact, I was a physics undergrad. And for my practicum, my last course, essentially, I did a study on the application of thin films on these substrates, and how these thin films would then allow you to more or less do measurements on femtosecond lasers, ultra-fast lasers. Had a lot of applications, but nevertheless, without getting into all of that stuff, I can remember I did a lot of research in that practicum near the end of my time there, and nevertheless, during that time, did all this research and had a university email that I was exchanging some of this information with professors, the chemicals we were using, some of the practices I was using, all that stuff I was exchanging over email, and then through my Gmail account, essentially. And then as I graduated, thank goodness, and became an alumni, the university extended to me an alumni email, and then also extended to me the ability to migrate all my past email into that new email, because, I still wanted to maintain ties and all that kind of good stuff, and all the contacts I'd made and some of that history as I was going to get a career and get a job and all that kind of good stuff. And so anyway, it really just kind of evokes this other question is, beyond some of the stuff we've already talked about, what concerns should universities have pertaining to students and faculty coming and going, and how do we protect FCI and CUI long term?
So the way we handled that was when we identified the regulated data, we put a control plan in place, and we contemplated in that control plan both the sharing of data as well as what will happen to that data when it has to be archived. So you really had a cradle to grave understanding of where that data would be. So it didn't really matter if the users were transient because the data was known. And then if researchers, which often happens, had archived data that they had worked on in a previous project, if they wanted to use that again to do a proposal or a future project, they had to come back to the regulatory office and ask permission and justify why they needed to use that data. So it brings up another issue that is kind of new in the research space, which is that researchers often previously, and still do to a large degree, believe they own their data. And the reality is they don't. By most university policies, the intellectual property policy, it's the university that owns that data, especially when there's a contractual obligation in place. So making sure that people understand they work with the data, and yes, they may get some benefit of that data, whether it's the licensing dollars that might come from a patent, or it's a publication, or it's a thesis or a dissertation. At the end of the day, the university owns that data, and it's not theirs to take with them, especially if it's regulated data. Now, universities also will facilitate the sharing of data with a future institution, et cetera. We do that all the time. But again, it's still that institutional obligation to recognize when regulated data have, obligations, and making sure that those that are using it are fully aware of the restrictions on that data.
Yeah, we do the exact same process at San Diego. But it does bring up a point, maybe a little orthogonal to CMMC. The scale of research data is 5 orders of magnitude larger than what we're used to dealing with at the enterprise. Your microscopy people, for example, generate terabytes a day, whereas your average student data warehouse may be 50 gigabytes or 100 gigabytes. And so when you start looking at data curation for these very large data sets, it's logistically complicated and it's expensive. And we're all wrestling with this. There's no magic solution, unfortunately.
Okay, so that actually leads me to another question. Because of the unique set of users, kind of what we've talked about already, nationality, they're transient, they're a subset of the faculty and not the whole faculty. Does it make sense to outsource for many universities? Or does it make sense why many universities are choosing to outsource certain aspects of their IT support for just those faculty and just to support that one aspect of the university, especially if they may have real specific needs, that have heightened security needs, that also have heightened requirements for the type of people that support those users and that data, that they be U.S. citizens or U.S. persons, all that kind of good stuff. Is there a good reason why universities are starting to kind of lean on these third-party services, even cloud services, instead of having things on premises, even going into that?
Certainly. So in a lot of cases, universities may not have enough contracts and have enough knowledge internal to be able to build an environment compliant with CMMC and be worth doing it to them. So it may be worthwhile to contract that out. Now, are there dangers? Yes, certainly. And you would need to make your contracts very good so that you make sure that your data is protected properly, segregated properly, and identify who is in charge of compliance, who's in charge of what processes, and make sure it's all set up clean and verified.
So I believe this is our 7th question, more or less. Why is it vital for research universities to mature their security policies and practices and operations for the sake of national security? I'm sure, Katie, you probably want to jump in on that one. if you don't mind.
Process down and you continually do it, you buy down risk. So that's first and foremost. So as you think about how freshmen are in-processed into a college. It's the same process. You repeat it again and again. That way, the faculty, the staff, as you're bringing in all these new students, it's less chaotic. They're streamlined. I mean, the fact that we got, I remember moving into Canisius College and we were given a 45-minute increment of time because there were only so many parking spots in front of the dorm. And they understood the process, and it brought down the risk of, chaos at the front door and overloading in elevators, etc. Same thing with cyber. I mean, you just need to have a dedicated process of onboarding, risk reduction strategy. So when you do have the transients that come through and come in and come out, you're buying down the risk of bad things happening. Going in and inducting, that we're going to change our passwords when you get a device, and you're going to move it off of a simple password like password, and you're going to put some heightened level of security to it. I've been speaking, recently about during the pandemic, the first few weeks of the pandemic, and I had come out, I was working on the FEMA task force for supply chain and getting PPE into the country. And Facebook, there was a post or a quiz, that was going around, times are hard right now. Let's think back to when things were easier. Right down the street you grew up on, your favorite season, your favorite color. Those are things that our adversaries use to break passwords, right? That's the type of information that makes it easy for a password breaking software to function. So it's vital for these companies, institutions, higher ed. You've got to have the basic cyber principles down so that as people move in and out of your environment, that they understand and you have some sense of assurance that they understand the risk associated and that they're buying it down by doing simple things, repeated simple tasks, so that the big things that come along, like when we have a solar winds event, etc., we have a much better chance of getting through it on the other side. For companies, I can tell you that your cybersecurity, they've, in the Solarium report, I'll go back to it, they talk about having a national cyber certification program. The next statement that they make is that we need to amend Sarbanes-Oxley for cybersecurity reporting and metrics in the SEC filings. Brand awareness is a big thing. So if you're a student at an academic institution and your intellectual property is stolen or is misused, and your school gets branded in that area that, they didn't protect it. Those are things that people put in the back of their mind. And then the last part of that is why all of this goes to, it's driving it to a conversation, which is cyber insurance. And the way that companies, institutions, academic research, you're going to end up, the end result in all of this is, as the Department of Defense, one of the big things that over the past 2 years in hearings and testimony is Congress is, hold people accountable for cyber incidents. Well, the only way you can really hold someone accountable is if you give them a level set standard that they're supposed to meet, and only when they are not doing those things can you hold them accountable. To cyber espionage, exfil. We're losing $600 billion a year, billion. And that's not including all the ransomware that we're not talking about because people are just paying it. So it's a big risk. If you're not doing those things in your institution, in your C-suite, in your company every single day, you're not buying down that risk. You're going to bring up your insurance rates without a doubt because you will have mistakes made that will cost people money. So it's vital that they ingrain that, and as people come in and out of your environments, they understand what is to be expected. This is the standard. These are the basics, so that your business can function, your institution can function, and not get that, ping of, oh, they have lax cyber skills, they're not going to protect it. You think about, I talked earlier about SolarWinds. I credit that company coming up front saying this is what happened. The brand awareness now is that they're really diligent, and we want to work with them, that they're working to protect my best interest. And that type of conversation, I think, will add to value to companies, to institutions. I care about you enough to say these are the risks. I'm invested enough that I have these protections in place, this process in place, because you are that important, your data, your PII, your PHI, et cetera. That's why it's vital.
Without properly matured security programs, that makes the universities more vulnerable, and they still have the same data, so they need to mature their programs to be able to better secure and provide better layers of security for that data and protect it well.
I've been a CISO for almost 25 years, and there was this interesting divide when I started, and it was at another large research institution, on the nature of the attacks we saw. At the time when I started, we really saw the attacks on campus for what I call internet noise. There's a little organized crime, but they were largely what I would call workaday attacks. They were just starting to get more sophisticated. And all the state-sponsored attacks were really targeting our supercomputer center. Today, it's not just because I have a big DoD footprint at UC San Diego, but it's very different. The level of sophistication of the attacks we see are breathtaking. We meet regularly with law enforcement, federal, and they're just like, these guys are really good. You're going to have a hard time stopping this. But nowadays, what we see is they're not targeting necessarily our sensitive or DoD research. It's sort of what I said earlier. They're looking for any foothold they can get, and they play a really long game. We've seen accounts that were idle for 7 years suddenly being used by state-sponsored attackers. So the volume has gone up, the sophistication has gone up. It's no longer ignorable on the general campus, and it's really clear that research is what they're aiming at. And this is, of course, part of why this is such a topic for us at my institution. Is we have this massive medical system here, supports not just San Diego but the whole region. And you add that to our DoD footprint, that intersection really puts a target on us. And so we're trying to mature across the board. Absolutely.
There is a line of people waiting to come in to our research institutions, our education system, unlike any other country in the world. People come here to learn, to get educated, because we are the technical, the innovators. We cultivate that. And you absolutely, what you just said is, you have to be constantly aware. We are the Mecca where people want to come. What we create. I made a statement not too long ago, and I think I irritated some people when I said it. I said, but China is 20 years behind us in developing. They didn't need to develop. They just took our R&D. Think about that. Think about the fact that the F-35 has a almost identical plane flying in China that has the same, I would say, operational flaw, design flaw that we had in the F-35. It's because they're very interested in taking our good ideas and building upon them. And the only way to really protect those, the research institutions and the academic and the young, brilliant, and middle-aged and older minds, what we're creating here is just basic cybersecurity. Just do your best every day to do the basics. And a lot of this will be, we have incredible cyber offense in U.S. Cybercom and what they're able to do, and with our, the three-letter agencies that are doing a phenomenal job protecting this country. You just got to work on protecting yourself.